Los Angeles, November 1978. The Beverly Hills Hotel's Crystal Ballroom was hosting the most exclusive charity gala in Hollywood history. 500 of the entertainment industry's most powerful people had gathered to raise money for children's hospitals, with tickets costing $10,000 each. Michael Caine sat at table 15, wearing his signature understated elegance, completely unaware that this evening would force him to confront the darkest corruption in Hollywood's power structure. Because when billionaire media mogul Theodore Blackwood took the stage and made one devastating announcement about Michael's career, what Michael revealed in response didn't just destroy Blackwood's empire, it exposed a web of manipulation that had controlled Hollywood for decades. The Beverly Hills Hotel had been transformed into a glittering palace of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's houses cast golden light over tables where studio heads sat alongside A-list actors, where media titans mingled with political power brokers, where decisions affecting millions of dollars in countless careers were made between courses of caviar and champagne. This wasn't just a charity event, it was a display of raw power. The guest list read like a who's who of American influence: media barons who controlled what stories got told, studio executives who greenlit $100 million films, politicians whose votes shaped industry regulation, and actors whose star power could make or break massive commercial ventures. At the center of it all sat Theodore Blackwood, 67 years old and worth an estimated $12 billion. Blackwood owned 3 major film studios, a television network, dozens of magazines and newspapers in 12 countries. He was the puppet master pulling strings behind Hollywood's biggest successes and failures, the man who could make careers with a phone call or destroy them with a whispered word to the right editor. But Blackwood's power extended far beyond mere business influence. For 30 years he had been building a carefully constructed image as Hollywood's most generous philanthropist, the caring billionaire who used his wealth to support worthy causes. Children's hospitals, veterans organizations, environmental groups all had benefited from Blackwood's highly publicized donations. What the public didn't know was that Blackwood's charity was a sophisticated money laundering operation designed to hide his most brutal business practices. Behind the scenes, he was systematically destroying independent filmmakers, manipulating awards competitions, and using his media empire to silence anyone who challenged his control over the industry. Michael Caine had been fighting Blackwood's influence for years, though most people didn't realize it. Several of Michael's projects had been mysteriously canceled after receiving enthusiastic initial support. Reviews of his films had been consistently negative in Blackwood-owned publications, despite critical acclaim elsewhere. Scripts that Michael wanted to develop had somehow ended up in the hands of Blackwood's preferred actors. But Michael had never been able to prove Blackwood's involvement. The billionaire was too careful, too well protected by layers of corporate structure and legal barriers. His attacks on Michael's career were always subtle, always deniable, always hidden behind legitimate business decisions. Tonight, however, Blackwood was about to make a critical mistake that would finally expose him. The evening had proceeded normally through cocktails and dinner. Michael had enjoyed conversations with fellow actors, directors he respected, and writers whose work he admired. He'd written a substantial check for the Children's Hospital charity, genuinely moved by the presentation about their work with young cancer patients. But as the evening's program began, Michael noticed something that made him uneasy. Several people he'd spoken with earlier were now avoiding eye contact. Conversations died when he approached tables. There was a strange tension in the air, as if people knew something he didn't. At 10:30, Theodore Blackwood rose to address the assembled crowd. Blackwood was an imposing figure despite his age, tall and commanding with silver hair that gleamed under the ballroom's lights. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, and he carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who had never heard the word no applied to anything he wanted. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's perfect acoustics, "tonight we gather to support a cause that touches all our hearts, the welfare of children who are fighting for their lives." The audience applauded politely, but Michael could sense an undercurrent of anticipation that had nothing to do with charitable giving. "But before we continue with our fundraising," Blackwood continued, "I want to take a moment to address an issue that affects our entire industry. An issue of integrity, of trust, of the values that should guide our professional relationships. Michael's stomach began to tighten. Something about Blackwood's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a standard charity speech. You see, we live in an industry where reputation is everything, where trust between professionals makes the difference between success and failure, where honesty and reliability are the foundation of every relationship. Blackwood paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Michael's table, which is why it pains me so deeply to reveal that one of our most celebrated colleagues has been living a lie that threatens the integrity of everything we've built together. The room went dead silent. Everyone understood that they were about to witness something unprecedented, but few grasped what was coming. For months, my legal team has been investigating serious allegations involving financial impropriety, breach of contract, and professional misconduct. Tonight, I feel compelled to share what we've discovered. Michael sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, but his mind was racing. He had no idea what Blackwood was building toward, but he knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. The individual in question has been secretly negotiating with foreign investors to finance projects that would circumvent Hollywood's established systems, projects that would avoid the oversight and quality control that protect both audiences and industry professionals. The accusations were vague but clearly serious. Several people in the audience looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they should be listening to what sounded like a legal matter being aired publicly. More troubling still, this individual has been using charitable organizations as fronts for tax evasion and money laundering, taking advantage of legitimate causes to hide questionable financial arrangements. Michael felt cold dread building in his chest. The accusations were becoming more specific, more damaging, and he was beginning to understand that he was the target. And perhaps most disappointingly, this individual has been spreading false information about colleagues and competitors, attempting to damage reputations and interfere with legitimate business relationships. Blackwood's voice grew stronger, more theatrical, building to what was clearly intended as a devastating climax. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great sadness that I must inform you that these allegations involve Michael Caine. The pronouncement hit the room like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silverware clattered against plates as people stopped eating. Every head turned toward Michael's table, where he sat with supernatural calm, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. I want to be absolutely clear, Blackwood continued, that these are not casual accusations. My legal team has spent 6 months gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, reviewing financial records. What they found is deeply troubling. Michael remained motionless, but those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of building fury and the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands gripped his napkin just a fraction too tightly. The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that goes back several years: secret meetings with questionable investors, financial arrangements designed to avoid legitimate oversight, efforts to manipulate media coverage and industry opinions through the spread of false information. The accusations were devastating precisely because they were so specific and so serious. If true, they would destroy Michael's reputation and likely end his career. If false, they represented character assassination on an unprecedented scale. I take no pleasure in revealing this information, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false regret. Michael Caine has been a respected colleague for many years, but the integrity of our industry must come before personal relationships. We cannot allow financial misconduct and professional deception to undermine the trust that makes our collaborations possible. Several people in the audience were nodding, apparently convinced by Blackwood's presentation. Others looked uncomfortable but seemed unsure what to think. The overall mood was shifting toward acceptance of Blackwood's accusations. Effective immediately, my studios will be suspending all current and planned projects involving Mr. Caine pending a full investigation of these allegations. I encourage other industry leaders to take similar precautions until this matter can be resolved. The announcement was a death sentence disguised as prudent business practice. If other studios followed Blackwood's lead, Michael would be effectively blacklisted from the industry, his career destroyed by accusations he couldn't immediately refute. Blackwood raised his glass in a gesture that managed to appear both regretful and triumphant. Tonight we gather to support children who are fighting for their lives. Let us not allow the selfish actions of one individual to diminish our commitment to that noble cause. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, but it was applause nonetheless. Blackwood had successfully positioned himself as the reluctant bearer of unpleasant truths, the industry leader making difficult decisions to protect everyone's interests. But as Blackwood prepared to return to his seat, a voice cut through the applause. "Theodore." The single word, spoken quietly but carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics, stopped Blackwood in his tracks. He turned to see Michael Caine rising from his chair. "I think you forgot to mention something," Michael said. His voice conversational but somehow commanding the attention of every person in the room. Blackwood looked confused. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd anticipated angry denials that would make Michael look guilty, or stunned silence that would confirm his guilt. He hadn't expected this calm, almost amused response. Michael began walking toward the stage, his movement unhurried but purposeful. "You forgot to tell them about the photographs." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for the first time all evening he looked genuinely shaken. Around the room people began murmuring to each other. Few knew what Michael was referring to, but the shift in Blackwood's demeanor was unmistakable. "I don't know what you're talking about," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its theatrical authority. Michael reached the stage and stepped up to the microphone without being invited. The evening's organizers looked panicked, unsure whether to intervene or let this confrontation play out. "Let me refresh your memory," Michael said, his voice still calm but carrying a steel undertone that everyone in the room could hear. "The photographs from 1963, the ones showing you with Senator Morrison and Judge Henley, the ones that explain how you've been controlling film permits, theater licenses, and industry regulations for the past 15 years. The room was absolutely silent now. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, but few people grasped the full implications of what was being discussed. Michael continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "Because you see, Theodore, I've spent the last 3 years investigating you, not for financial gain, not for career advantage, but because I got tired of watching you destroy good people who got in your way." Blackwood tried to regain his composure. "These are baseless accusations. Sit down," Michael said quietly, and something in his tone made Blackwood comply immediately, sinking into a chair near the podium. Michael looked out at the assembled crowd, his expression serious but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about Theodore Blackwood's real business model, not the charitable, industry-supporting image he's cultivated, but the systematic corruption that's been poisoning Hollywood for decades." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. In 1963, Theodore paid Senator William Morrison $200,000 to kill a bill that would have increased oversight of media consolidation. The payment was made through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, with the money ultimately traced back to Theodore's personal accounts. The audience was riveted. This wasn't just a personal attack, this was an indictment of systemic corruption that many people in the room had suspected but never dared to address publicly. Judge Harold Henley received similar payments in exchange for favorable rulings on antitrust cases involving Theodore's acquisitions of smaller studios. Over 5 years, Theodore paid Henley nearly $500,000, always through intermediaries, always carefully hidden. Several people in the audience gasped. Dame Elizabeth Taylor looked mortified. Director George Lucas was staring at Blackwood with obvious disgust. But the financial corruption was just the beginning. Michael continued. "Theodore has been using his media empire to systematically destroy anyone who challenges his control over the industry." Michael's voice grew harder, more focused. "Independent filmmakers who refuse to sell their companies find themselves unable to get distribution deals. Actors who turn down projects from Theodore's studios suddenly receive negative coverage in his magazines and newspapers. Directors who criticize his business practices discover that their films receive 1-star reviews regardless of their actual quality." The indictment was devastating, and people around the room were beginning to nod in recognition. Many had witnessed or experienced the phenomena Michael was describing. Take the case of director Robert Altman. In 1975, Robert publicly criticized Theodore's monopolistic practices in an interview with Rolling Stone. Within 6 months, every major magazine owned by Theodore had published negative pieces about Robert's work. His next 3 films received uniformly terrible reviews in Theodore's publications, despite critical acclaim elsewhere. Michael looked directly at Blackwood, who appeared to have aged 10 years in the past few minutes. Or consider actress Jane Fonda. When Jane refused to sign an exclusive contract with one of Theodore's studios in 1976, she suddenly found herself the subject of vicious gossip in Theodore's magazines. Stories about her personal life, her political beliefs, her professional relationships, all designed to damage her reputation and reduce her commercial value. The personal examples were making the abstract accusations concrete and undeniable. People in the audience were beginning to understand the scope of Blackwood's manipulation. But Theodore's cruelest tactics have been reserved for young actors and filmmakers who can't fight back. Michael said, his voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. In 1974, a young director named David Lynch approached Theodore's studio with a script for an experimental film. Theodore's executives loved the project and offered Lynch a development deal. But when Lynch refused to give Theodore's studio complete creative control, the deal was canceled and Lynch was blacklisted. Michael's eyes moved across the room, making contact with various people as he spoke. Theodore made sure that Lynch couldn't get meetings at other studios. He spread rumors about Lynch being difficult to work with, unreliable, commercially unviable. For 3 years, one of the most innovative directors of his generation couldn't get a project financed because Theodore had marked him as untouchable. The silence in the room was profound. Everyone was beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a personal dispute, but learning about systematic abuse that had shaped their entire industry. The evidence I'm describing isn't based on speculation or rumor, Michael continued. It comes from documents obtained through a 3-year investigation conducted by journalist Bob Woodward and a team of researchers working for the Washington Post. The mention of Woodward's name sent a ripple of recognition through the audience. This wasn't just Hollywood gossip. This was serious investigative journalism from the reporter who had exposed Watergate. Theodore has been so confident in his power, so certain of his protection, that he's kept detailed records of his corruption. Bank records, correspondence with judges and politicians, internal memos discussing strategies for destroying competitors, it's all there. Michael paused, letting the implications sink in. The Washington Post will be publishing a comprehensive exposé next Sunday. 15 pages documenting Theodore's bribery of public officials, his manipulation of media coverage, his systematic destruction of careers and companies that threatened his control. Blackwood's face was gray, his bearing completely defeated. He understood that his carefully constructed empire was about to collapse. But I wanted you all to hear about it first, Michael continued, because Theodore has just demonstrated his methods in real time. The accusations he made against me tonight? They're completely fabricated, invented by the same people who create false stories about anyone who challenges Theodore's power. Michael's voice grew stronger, more focused. Theodore chose to attack me tonight because I've been helping Woodward's investigation. For 3 years I've been providing information, connecting dots, helping to build the case that will finally expose Theodore's corruption. The revelation explained everything. Why Blackwood had chosen this moment, why the accusations were so specific, why he had felt confident enough to make them publicly. Every allegation Theodore made about me can be easily disproven with basic fact-checking. The foreign investors? They don't exist. The tax evasion? My financial records are completely open to examination. The spreading of false information? The irony is almost too perfect. Michael looked back at Blackwood, who was now slumped in his chair, completely defeated. Theodore, you've spent 30 years using your wealth and power to corrupt judges, bribe politicians, and destroy the careers of good people who got in your way. You've turned what should be a creative industry into a feudal system where you play king and everyone else begs for your favor. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. But your biggest mistake was thinking that you were untouchable, that your money and influence would protect you forever, that you could destroy anyone who challenged you without consequences. Michael's voice softened but lost none of its power. Well, the consequences have arrived, Theodore, and they're going to be published in newspapers around the world next Sunday. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had followed Blackwood's attack. This was the silence of people processing a fundamental shift in their understanding of how their industry worked. Finally, Blackwood stood up slowly. Without saying a word, he walked off the stage and left the ballroom. Several people tried to stop him as he passed their tables, but he ignored them completely. Within minutes, his entire entourage had followed him out. Michael watched him go, then looked back at the audience. "I came here tonight to support children who are fighting for their lives," he said, his voice returning to its normal conversational tone. "And I still want to do that, because there are people in this room who create beautiful work while treating their colleagues with respect and dignity." He gestured toward the assembled crowd. "Those are the people who represent the real future of our industry, not the ones who use their power to corrupt and control, but the ones who use it to create and collaborate. Not the ones who hide behind wealth to excuse their cruelty, but the ones who use their success to lift others up." The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever experienced. It started slowly, with a few people clapping uncertainly, but it quickly built into something thunderous and sustained. People were on their feet, not just applauding but cheering, not just recognizing Michael's courage but celebrating the end of an era of corruption. But the real impact of that evening extended far beyond the applause. Within hours, the story was spreading through Hollywood and beyond. By morning, it was front-page news around the world. "Media mogul exposed in corruption scandal," read the New York Times headline. "Hollywood's hidden tyrant falls," declared the Los Angeles Times. But more importantly, the investigation Michael had helped facilitate was about to bear fruit. The Washington Post's expose, when published the following Sunday, contained evidence of corruption that went far beyond what Michael had revealed at the charity gala. The 15-page investigation detailed not just Blackwood's bribery and media manipulation, but his connections to organized crime figures who had helped him silence competitors and intimidate potential witnesses. Bank records showed payments to hitmen who had threatened journalists investigating Blackwood's business practices. Phone logs revealed conversations with judges who had thrown out lawsuits against his companies. Theodore Blackwood never recovered from the scandal. Within a week, federal investigators had seized his financial records and begun criminal proceedings. His media empire crumbled as advertisers pulled their support and shareholders demanded his resignation. He died in federal prison 18 months later, still maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. But the impact on Hollywood was even more significant. The revelation of Blackwood's systematic corruption prompted a comprehensive investigation of industry practices. Studios were forced to divest their media holdings. New regulations prevented media companies from owning both production facilities and distribution networks. The era of monopolistic control over the entertainment industry was finally ending. 3 months after the Beverly Hills Hotel confrontation, Michael received a letter from David Lynch, the director who had been blacklisted by Blackwood's interference. "Dear Michael," Lynch wrote, "for 4 years I've been trying to understand why my career was derailed just when it was beginning to take off. Thanks to your courage in exposing Theodore Blackwood, I finally know the truth. More importantly, I can finally move forward with the knowledge that the system that destroyed my opportunities has been dismantled. Razorhead goes into production next month, funded by investors who actually care about artistic vision rather than monopolistic control. Thank you for giving me my career back." Similar letters arrived from dozens of filmmakers, actors, and industry professionals who had been damaged by Blackwood's manipulation. Young artists who had given up on their dreams found renewed hope. Established professionals who had been blacklisted were finally able to return to work. The charity gala itself raised more money than any previous event in Hollywood history. The revelation of Blackwood's corruption had somehow galvanized the entertainment community's commitment to legitimate charitable work. The Children's Hospital received enough funding to build an entire new wing dedicated to cancer research. 6 months after the scandal broke, Michael was approached by investigative journalist Bob Woodward for an in-depth interview about his role in exposing Blackwood. "What made you decide to help with the investigation?" Woodward asked. "It wasn't really a decision," Michael replied. "It was more of a recognition. I'd spent years watching good people get destroyed by Theodore's manipulation, but I didn't understand the scope of what he was doing until journalists like you started connecting the dots. Once I realized the extent of his corruption, I couldn't not help." Woodward pressed further. "But you knew there would be risks. Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in America. He could have destroyed your career." Michael smiled. "He tried to destroy my career anyway. That's what finally convinced me that someone had to stop him. When you're dealing with a bully, sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to protect everyone else too." The interview, published as a cover story in The Atlantic, became one of the most widely read pieces about Hollywood corruption ever written. It established Michael not just as an actor and entertainer, but as a principled individual willing to risk everything to fight systematic abuse. Years later, when Michael was asked about that night at the Beverly Hills Hotel, he said, "I didn't plan to bring down Theodore Blackwood's empire. I went there to write a check for sick children and enjoy an evening with colleagues. But when Theodore chose to attack me with fabricated accusations, he gave me the platform I needed to tell the truth about his corruption." But Michael's role in the investigation had been far more significant than his modest assessment suggested. He had been quietly working with Woodward's team for over 3 years, providing not just information but strategic guidance about how to approach potential sources within the entertainment industry. Michael understood the psychology of Hollywood in ways that we journalists couldn't. Woodward reflected in his memoir. He knew which actors might have information but would be too scared to talk, which directors had been victimized but didn't realize it was part of a pattern. One particularly significant breakthrough had come through Michael's relationship with actress Faye Dunaway, who had been systematically destroyed by Blackwood's media machine after refusing to sign an exclusive contract with his studios in 1976. "Faye was a wreck when I first talked to her about cooperating," Michael recalled. "She'd been so thoroughly gaslighted by Theodore's people that she actually believed some of their lies about her own behavior. It took months of careful conversation to help her understand that what had happened wasn't her fault." Dunaway's testimony proved crucial because she had kept detailed records of her interactions with Blackwood's representatives. Her files included contracts that had been offered and withdrawn, letters from magazine editors, and documentation of the systematic campaign to destroy her reputation. The investigation had also uncovered the true extent of Blackwood's influence over award ceremonies and critical recognition. Internal documents revealed that he had been paying critics to write negative reviews of competitors' films while promoting projects from his own studios. Most shocking of all, the investigation revealed that Blackwood had been using private investigators to gather blackmail material on industry figures. The files included compromising photographs, financial records obtained through illegal means, and personal information that could be used as leverage. The Senate hearings that followed became must-watch television. Michael appeared as the committee's star witness, spending 3 days detailing his knowledge of Blackwood's operations. "Mr. Caine," asked Senator Joseph Biden, "you knew exposing Mr. Blackwood would likely end your career. What made you decide that stopping him was worth that risk?" Michael's answer became one of the most quoted passages. "Senator, I realized that if I didn't speak out, Theodore would just move on to destroying the next person who challenged him. At some point, someone has to say enough. Someone has to be willing to sacrifice their own interests to protect everyone else's." The hearings also revealed the personal cost Michael had paid. Several studio executives testified that they had been pressured by Blackwood to cancel projects involving Michael. Magazine editors admitted to being ordered to publish negative stories about his personal life. But the hearings also highlighted the broader changes that Michael's actions had catalyzed. Director Francis Ford Coppola testified that he had been unable to finance Apocalypse Now for 3 years because Blackwood had convinced distributors the project was commercially unviable. "Michael Caine gave us back our industry," Coppola told the committee. "For too long we'd all been operating under Theodore's rules. Michael's courage broke that system and reminded us what creative freedom actually looks like." The long-term impact extended far beyond Hollywood. Congress passed comprehensive media reform legislation. The Federal Communications Commission implemented new ownership rules. The Department of Justice created a special unit focused on investigating entertainment industry corruption. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The revelation of Blackwood's systematic abuse had forced the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and the treatment of vulnerable workers. Michael's confrontation marked a turning point. Media historian Dr. Sarah Chen wrote, "It was the moment when Hollywood began transitioning from a feudal system controlled by a few powerful men to a more democratic industry where talent and integrity could compete with wealth and connections." Young filmmakers who had been shut out found new opportunities. Independent studios gained access to distribution networks. Artists who had been blacklisted were finally able to return to work. Michael's own career flourished in the post-Blackwood era. Directors who had been afraid to work with him now sought him out specifically because of his courage and integrity. Dressed to Kill, Educating Rita, and Hannah and her sisters all came to him during this period. Ironically, Theodore's attempt to destroy me ended up enhancing my reputation, Michael reflected in his memoir. By standing up to him, I became associated with integrity and courage rather than just acting ability. The personal satisfaction went beyond professional success. Michael often spoke about receiving letters from young artists who credited his example with giving them courage to pursue their dreams despite obstacles. One particularly moving correspondence came from director Spike Lee. "Dear Mr. Caine, I wanted to thank you for showing me that sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right. Your example taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is break the rules that need to be broken." Today, when entertainment industry professionals face systematic abuse, many remember Michael Caine's confrontation with Theodore Blackwood. Film schools teach courses on the scandal. Business schools examine Theodore's corruption as an example of how unchecked power leads to abuse. The Beverly Hills Hotel Charity Gala became a turning point in Hollywood history. It marked the end of an era when one individual could control an entire industry through corruption, and the beginning of a more democratic system where talent and integrity mattered more than wealth and connections. When Michael Caine destroyed Theodore Blackwood's reputation in front of Hollywood's elite, he didn't just expose one man's corruption, he dismantled a system of abuse that had controlled American entertainment for decades. He proved that sometimes the most powerful response to systematic corruption is simply telling the truth in front of people who have the power to demand change. And he showed that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to risk everything you've worked for to protect the principles that make your work meaningful. The night Michael Caine took down a billionaire's empire remains a testament to the power of individual integrity to transform entire industries and inspire generations of artists to fight for justice, creativity, and truth.